Good afternoon and welcome to this online conversation. We are so glad that you have joined us today. My name is Noel Snyder and I'm a program manager at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the third conversation in a summer webinar series that we're calling Everyday Faith: Possibilities, Limits, and Callings. And not only is this the third conversation in that series, but this is also the second time that I have the privilege of talking with my colleague, Dr. Danjuma Gibson. We talked about a month ago, and today I'm happy to be picking up that conversation where we left off. Before we do that, just a quick introduction for those of you who may not know him. Danjuma Gibson is an associate professor of pastoral care at Calvin Theological Seminary, and he is also in private practice as a psychotherapist in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Prior to joining Calvin Seminary, he was the senior pastor of a church in Chicago for over 16 years and was bivocational as a commercial banker during that time. Currently, Dr. Gibson is working on a project where he's been examining the lives of several quote-unquote titans of African American history, and that's the tentative title of the project that he's working on, Through the Eyes of Titans. Danjuma, I'm looking forward to talking more with you about that today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for this opportunity. I appreciate it, Noel.
Yeah, so why don't we just start there again for those who may not have been with us on the first webinar. Could I just ask you again to introduce the writing project that you're working on, and what is it that you're working on exactly, and how did it come about?
Thank you. This has really evolved over the last several years. You and I were a part of a seminar a few years back before COVID that was on African American autobiographies. And initially, I thought this would be just a straightforward project to sort of capture some of the work that we did in that seminar, but to continue some of the work that I started with Frederick Douglass in my first book. And how can we use autobiography in our own understanding of spiritual lives and our own understanding of leadership and in discipleship in the Christian faith. But then things start to happen around us that impacted this. You have this horrible killing of George Floyd right before our eyes. It's really, in my memory, a first public modern day lynching. And then things continue on. Here in the state of Michigan, you see armed protesters at the state capitol. You hear about kidnapping attempts of a public official. And then this year, we see this violent insurrection on January 6th in the nation's capital. So you're seeing all of these images on television and social media that you haven't seen since the mid-20th century, since the 1950s, the 1960s. A sort of a reckoning, this racial reckoning to show us or make us ask the question, have you made that much progress as you thought? But then I'm also thinking at the same time, Noel, we have a proliferation of literature on racism, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, on whether we're talking about fragility or seminars, webinars like this, anti-racism, all of that. So I'm asking myself, and I don't have a problem with that, but how much of what we are seeing today has not already been talked about by other authors during the same time, during the 1950s and 60s? You have a Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, writers, theologians, Martin Luther King, James Cone. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I'm asking myself, is this really about the absence of knowledge? Or I put on my pastoral psychology lens and I'm thinking, what's the effect of when we idealize and mythologize history? And when we do that, on the one hand, idealizing can be healthy because it helps us grow our own emotional and psychological and spiritual maturity when we have the need to sort of to project special features on other human beings, whether that's to make them superhuman, certain elements of morality. We have to imagine them in a certain way. And that can be fine. That can be healthy to a certain extent. But taken too far, it actually, I believe, undermines our own capacity to do the work that we have, that we as human beings, that we are called to do, let alone to do the work that we are called to do, that God has mandated us to do in the Christian faith. And so in this project, I am trying to demythologize these titans. Now, the title of it is a paradox because I'm calling them titans, but I'm doing that for a reason. When we talk about therapeutic work, when an idealization can be ruptured, when the picture of a hero is ruptured, that's a good thing. Because now you are forced to turn inwardly and to assess, how can I now do the work that I had idealized others doing? And so that's what I'm hoping this project will do. It's not necessarily introducing us to new information that we've never seen, but my hope is if I can demythologize these titans, if I can demythologize the period they lived in and show how what we are seeing today is not new.
Yeah.
These were not heroes. These were normal people like us. These were people of faith like us. They didn't go out saying, I want to be an activist. They didn't go out saying, wow, today is a good day to die. They had passions and fears like us, but they responded to the call. Now, how can we do that today? Yeah. I'm hoping this project can at least begin that sort of psychodynamic process as people read it in their own communities and in their own lives.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And if I'm getting it right, then that is what's lying behind this methodology that you're bringing to when you're reading autobiographies or biographical information about people's stories. You said in our previous webinar that when you're doing that, you're reading these stories, you're reading these autobiographical reflections, and you're attending to them as if they were a client sitting in front of you in a counseling session. And so I'm wondering, now that it seems to make more sense now where that is coming from and what are some of the goals as far as demythologizing them, so we can actually learn how to practice the same things that they have practiced in a way to not get ourselves off the hook of not doing the work and not acting upon it in our own lives. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more even about where you said the goals, but I'm wondering where that came from in your own life and practice. Is this something that you've done even before you started your training as a psychologist?
It was actually a mistake. I came upon it by mistake. I was studying for my doctoral comprehensive exams. I know you know how that feels. Remember how that feels.
Yep.
And I needed to take a break. Those exams can last for days or a couple of weeks. And in preparing for it and studying the various subjects, part of taking a break, I would read a novel that I enjoyed. So I came across Frederick Douglass's first autobiography, and I was fascinated by it. I said, wow, this is incredible. How did this guy do it? And I wasn't a Douglass scholar. And then after I read that, about a month or so later, I discovered he had a second autobiography. And I read that. Now, as I'm reading this, this is sort of taking away from my studying my comprehensive exams. But I got into it. And then I discovered after that, wow, he has a third one. And so this question is starting in my mind. Why does a person have to write 3 autobiographies? What is that all about? And even before I thought about the ultimate project and my dissertation project, it became clear to me that autobiography can be used as a tool, as a mirror into our own souls. Mm-hmm. Especially when we think about our own personal development, spiritual development, our own self-work. More often than not, we need help in terms of how we do introspective work. Because throughout our lives, we built up defensive mechanisms to repress pain, to repress grief, to repress trauma. And generally, especially in theological education, but also in Christian education throughout, when we think of, if you want to think of it as self-work or discipleship, we focus on literature that's propositional in nature. And so the idea is acquire knowledge, or the assumption is if you know better, you'll do better. But when you can begin to look at this through the lives of others, how they responded to the faith, how they responded to the political and social context of their time, how they talked about God, how they talked about the church, their joys, concerns, fears. It can serve as an entree into our own souls, where we are connecting with their humanity. And I think that is the power of autobiography. Many times in the present, we think that we're onto something new, that our spiritual understanding, our theological understanding is advanced. And I don't want to take away from our narcissism. I don't want to take away from our ego. But the burden of proof is on us more often than not to disprove tradition. And it can be humbling when we think today that we've done all we can, that or we feel like we're going to throw our hands up. Autobiography has a way of bringing conviction to show someone else has walked this path. They've asked the same questions. They didn't have the resources we had. And look what they were able to do. How do you understand the faith through their eyes or through the eyes of titans? And if you object, the burden of proof is really on us.
So if I'm hearing you right here, then
sound like a therapist.
Let me try to reflect back on what I'm hearing. If someone doesn't actually have the same therapy training, which I don't, that you have, but maybe wants to learn this method of reading history in a similar way to what you're describing, are there certain questions that you would recommend a person learning how to ask? Are there certain habits that you would recommend people trying to develop so they could look at other people's lives in this way?
Sure. In my first book, well, currently my only book, in the Psychobiography of Frederick Douglass, I use this term, the hermeneutic, and hermeneutics, we're talking about interpretation, a hermeneutic of affective attunement. And I talk about this early on in the book. And the reason I do is you cannot read a narrative or the works of those who were enslaved. You cannot read the literature. Another example can be the Autobiography of Harriet Jacobs. Whether we're talking about a Harriet Jacobs, a Sojourner Truth, or a Frederick Douglass, your emotions are going to be triggered. We live in a day where we do everything possible to alleviate the tension. We like to be comfortable at all costs. And if something makes us comfortable, we have learned to say, and I fear we are seeing too much of this in the body of Christ. If it makes me uncomfortable, then it must be wrong. This hermeneutic of affective attunement suggests that as you are reading Douglass and he talks about his horrors, if you're going to understand who Douglass is, you first have to understand how he was terrorized and how for example, the terror of night on a slave pen, on the plantation. If you're going to understand their faith, you have to understand the terror. And so with this hermeneutic of affective attunement, you don't need psychological training to just say simply, when you find yourself triggered emotionally as you're reading autobiography, one of the best questions you can ask yourself is, what is that all about? Mm-hmm. Because if I'm feeling this, more often than not, the author of this autobiography was feeling this. Or if I'm feeling repulsed or put off, what does this mean in terms of the implications of what I am reading? This is what I love when you in Hebrews, it says, we don't have a high priest who has not been touched with the feelings of our infirmities. Christ is who he is to us because Christ allowed himself to be touched with the feeling of human terror, human infirmity. Likewise, when you are reading these autobiographies, instead of looking for the conflict-free zone, instead of looking for the zone of happiness, take it when you can get it, don't get me wrong. You cannot read the autobiography of an African-American enslaved woman without also being willing to feel the best you can the terror as well. So that's one thing. Sometimes in psychology, we call it use of self. So in a therapeutic room, you have to have done this enough to know what is your stuff, but also if you are feeling something, what does it say about the therapeutic encounter of what the person in front of you could be experiencing?
Yeah.
Also, you could be reading this and it turns into a mirror. It can help you. It could be a light bulb experience. You can read that and say, hey, it's like me putting a mirror in front of you. That's exactly what's going on in my life right now. I didn't have the words to it, but now I have the words. I have a language for it. I have a way to engage in sometimes what I call narrative reconstruction. This is what's going on. And so sometimes the literature can act as a mirror. We've already talked about idealization. Now I'm trying to demythologize, but in human development, idealizing, using the literature where someone inspires you, their work motivates you to do the same. that can be fine. So even without training or formal training, this affective attunement or being aware
Mm-hmm.
of your own emotions, number one, um, and asking yourself, instead of being dismissive of your emotions, especially when they are triggering, instead asking yourself, what is this all about? If I'm feeling terror, if I'm feeling repulsed, if I'm feeling angry, what does this say about me and my capacity to listen to someone else's story? So
Mm-hmm.
that's the hermeneutic of affective attunement. But also, how does this work a mirror in my own life to help me give words to what sometimes I just need help creating a narrative for what's going on? Or I could idealize.
Yeah. And idealization, you're saying, is not always a bad thing. It
Correct.
just has to be recognized for what it is,
Mm-hmm.
because there could be this inspirational factor that could actually have really positive fruit. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. It helps us get beyond this sort of um, binary black and white categories
Mhm.
of when we think about idealization or looking at other people's stories and what makes them such great people and standout examples for us.
Mhm.
I just want to pause just to say that those of you who are with us live, Dr. Gibson welcomes your questions throughout this webinar. So if there's something that he's saying that you want more information about, or you have a question about, he would love to be in dialogue throughout this webinar with you. So feel free to use the Q&A to type that in, and we'll keep an eye on that. Last time we talked, we had a little bit of a chance to talk more specifically about some of the people's lives that you're looking at. And we talked a little bit more about Fannie Lou Hamer last time and some of the themes and lessons that you're learning from her life. I wonder if you have some further examples and stories from some of the history that you're looking at that you want to share with us today, and what are some of the themes that you're drawing out of other people's stories?
Sure. Thanks for that.
Mhm.
Um, so let's stay with Frederick Douglass as an example. I've talked about a lot of, I responded to this question, where did he come from? When I thought about his prolific writing in the 19th century, and his scholarship and his activism. Where does someone like that come from um, when they have experienced the trauma from birth of the slaveocracy? And so you may be aware of, and I'm sure our listeners are aware of over the last several months now, and even before now, in North America, how researchers and others have been coming across these mass grave sites of indigenous human beings, of Native Americans in these boarding schools from the 1800s on to the turn of the century. And I was watching television a few weeks ago, and um, there was one that came out where they discovered this in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And as I was listening to the name of this school, I said, wait a minute. Frederick Douglass gave his famous speech, and listen to the name of this speech, Self-Made Men,
Hmm.
at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And part of his lecture, he was praising the school for their work. Now, we know today these schools were basically set up to rob a precious people of their culture and to indoctrinate them into European culture. And so much work now is being done not only from a sociological perspective, but even theological work today to make amends for that, to undo that damage. So you have to ask yourself this question. Even in his speech, now I've read that entire speech, it's actually a little booklet. Well, does Douglass at the time, does he know that this is going on? You can make the argument that he doesn't know. I know there are historians who would possibly disagree with what I'm saying, and they would suggest that, well, he was a product of his time, and this is what was happening. But in many cases, when historians do that, they are arguing the case that I am about to make. On the one hand, you could say Douglass didn't know the full implications of what was happening at that school when he gave this speech called Self-Made Men, but it was clear in his speech that he was making the case for those students. You should be like I am. He defines his definition of self-made men, and in fairness, he does say in the speech that he's not saying that people are independent, that they don't need others, but he's making the case. He says, when I say a self-made man, I am saying people who are able to overcome when their environment is not conducive for them to overcome. And so he names all of these great figures. I think George Washington is in there. I think he mentions at some point Benjamin Banneker as an example. He mentions Abraham Lincoln, but it's clear that he's also pointing to himself. Mm-hmm. So why do I bring this up? In many of our environments, Noel, as you know, we have a very defined understanding of what is sin. Sin is X, Y, Z. I come from a very conservative background, fundamental background, where personal chastity, holiness, piety is of the, being pious, living a pious life is of the essence. I'm sure you're familiar with that as well. The thing is, and the danger with that is, once we check those boxes, we tend to believe that we are free and clear. Mm. But as I do my research on this, I am asking a different question beyond sin talk. And that question is this: what do we call it when history says what we thought was right in the past, actually we got it very wrong? It seemed so right to Douglass at that time. Are there reasons a historian can look and let him off the hook? Yes. However, as a psychohistorian, I can't exactly do that, because part of my argument was he possessed one of the most refined moral compasses of his age. The things that he praised in that speech, or that you could see to some extent, and who knows what he was able to see. I'm not saying that he saw the things were evident, that he saw children dying. I'm not saying any of that. But he took exception to it when he was also talking about how his own people were in bondage. How do we run the risk of becoming a participant in oppressive systems when they benefit us? And so I think moving beyond this sin talk, there is another area that is incredibly important, but it's something that we don't like to talk about. Once I've checked the boxes on all these other things, what will history say about our work? And if we are lucky enough to be alive, what are those things now that we are doing that seem so right, but 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we will look back and possibly say, I got that wrong, and it hurt a lot of people. My courage failed me in that moment. And because I didn't have courage, others paid the price. We don't like to talk about that in our sin talk. And it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Even with this Carlisle Indian Industrial School and Douglass's speech of self-made men, as he's looking at those students, and come on, he's patting himself on the back. We have to be honest about that. What will history say about us? I'll pause right there in case you have some feedback or questions with that one.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. First is when you talk about the courage and saying, having to say years from now, possibly, my courage failed me then. I got that wrong. Are you saying that there's a sense in which courage requires of us to constantly be asking that question of ourselves in the present moment? How is what I'm doing and participating in and supporting right now going to be seen years down the line? And might there be something that I don't have the courage to see right now, but if I did, I could actually start to see some of these things and change?
Hey, I can't say it any better than what you just said. I mean, we're talking now about praxis. And I think the question is not, how do I get it right? I think the better question is, how do I not get it so wrong now? And are there mechanisms? How do I ask the right questions now? I have some thoughts about that. But what will history reveal about the present moment, about societies and systems, ways of thinking? For instance, when you talk about the slave narrative or the enslaved, they call them slave narratives. I like to call them enslaved narratives. That's my term because I don't like slave as a proper noun but when you read those narratives, a lot of the titles you will see in the 19th century, it would say written by themselves, by himself, or written by herself. They did that because that was an important part. The thought was you didn't know how to write or think for yourself. So it was important that you let the audience know you wrote that yourself. I say that to say when Douglass then makes a speech about self-made men, there's something he's trying to get across. It's not necessarily the way it will come across if you and I went to a school and talked about a self-made man and we're so it's not the ego trip that you would say today versus, one could argue he was well within his rights because an argument is being made, he can think for himself. So I have that. But even in a situation like that, where what he is celebrating in that moment is death dealing. How do we grapple with that? But it also, when we talk about demythologizing, instead of looking to Douglass as a perfect hero, I hope with the audience, I can sort of demythologize it in a way where we are saying we should begin to look at ourselves and ask that question as well. Mm-hmm. As we lessen the need for heroes, as we lessen the need for perfect people, as I lessen, all of this is therapeutic, as I lessen the tension in our communities to divide the world between all good and all bad. And generally, where we find ourselves, we're on the all good side.
That's helpful. And if I'm hearing you right, the idea that what Douglass was promoting in that moment he could have possibly been blind to, and it's unclear maybe whether that was willful blindness or some sort genuine ignorance, because it was being hidden from him. But in whatever way, he's not seeing this, and possibly because this is one part of that system that benefits him. Is that part of what you're saying? And so we had a question that came in that then how can we learn to do that? Wait, can you talk a little bit more about what it means that we are engaging in these things that can be oppressive to others, but we don't see it, or we're not willing to
Sure.
recognize it or get out of it because they benefit us?
Sure. That's a great question. Another way of looking at that question is, how do we understand when something can be both good and bad at the same time? Helpful and so for me, it's helpful, but at the same time, it's harming others. So how do we answer that? How does the law of love then say we should answer that? So you look at a Romans 14, where Paul says, even though you may have your freedom, and even though you may be able to eat this meat sacrificed to an idol without your conscience being seared, if it is representing a searing of your brother's conscience, the law of love says, now, how do we do that? Foundational to my theology, I think, at least if I look at polar ends of the scripture, of the biblical witness, is Pentecost versus the Tower of Babel, where God says, this is dangerous. They're all speaking the same language. If everybody is talking the same way, thinks the same ideas, which also in this text I'm calling social fundamentalism. Many times people just think of religious fundamentalism. I think there's social fundamentalism as well. That's dangerous. So he scatters the language. And what we see at Pentecost is that divine disclosure is coming directly to a multiplicity of people around the world. So what does that mean? The question is not how I can get it perfectly right. The question, remember, is how do we not get it so wrong? Mm. We lessen it with the multiplicity of voices. Mm. However you can understand multiplicity. In some ways, and let's say, okay, you and I are in academia. If peer review in academia is only by other academics, is there a risk that you and I can get something really wrong if it's only other academics reviewing it?
Hello.
Now, I've said this before, and some people think that I am discouraging peer review. No, I am saying, as an example, peer review is needed. My point is, something can pass with flying colors with peer review and absolutely mean nothing for the community at all. Mm-hmm. And many times we say, well, you have to say it in a language that people who are not in the academy, that they can accept. Maybe, but I have another position on that. Maybe people in the community understand what we are saying and know they're saying you are totally irrelevant. Mm. It's not that we don't understand your work, but it is totally irrelevant. It's not meaningful. Mm-hmm. How can we get it so wrong? So part of the praxis that you so eloquently, as you mirrored back to me what I'm trying to say, but I think you said it better, by the way. Part of that is the multiplicity of voices, the multiplicity of experiences, the multiplicity of cultures. One time I told a group of students, what you are preaching on Sunday morning in Grand Rapids, can that preach in South Africa? Mm. Can it preach in Haiti? Can it preach in an impoverished area?
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. You're turning over some tables that I love to see turned over right now. and you're doing it all in with such grace and love behind it for God's world and the people throughout it. And again, I think it's so important, even just what you just said. Okay, can it preach in South Africa, in Haiti, in these other places? You're not saying you have to get it all right, all the time and be perfect in that sense, but to not ask the question, to not consider those different contexts, to not consider even where I'm located right here in Grand Rapids compared to if I was 5 miles down the street. To not ask those questions, that's when we get into these problems. And the multiplicity of voices, like you said, starts to get us back there to where we need to be.
It's in Paul's writing in Corinthians on love. Why do we need it? Because at the end of that chapter, he emphasizes we only know in part. We only know in part. Even when we think we have it incredibly right, history can show us that we got it wrong. And I think the courage to ask those kinds of questions is missing in leadership, because we don't like to imagine ourselves as villains. And for those who are from a Reformed tradition, I think this is where having a low view of anthropology, i.e., total depravity, it's not to be used as a tool for self-condemnation, but it's an awareness of the technology that we always possess to do some unfortunate things or to participate in unfortunate activities or systems because they benefit us in that moment.
So another question that I told you I was going to ask in advance was, even though these are historical titans, they can seem larger than life to us sometimes. What parts of their stories can help us to humanize them? And in many ways, you've been answering that question now for the last half an hour.
Sure.
Anything more that you would add to that?
Yeah, categories of fear. For example, I think one of the most unfortunate and I want to be careful how I say this. One of the most, I'll put it like this: when we idealize the deaths of titans as if they just walked into their deaths because of what they were fighting for, as if they walked into it with open arms, as if their families were not traumatized, as if those who were around them did not live in fear after that. So to adopt a traumatological lens in how we study history. And so if you don't have to be trained, just simply ask yourself, if I were shot, how do I think my family would feel? How would I feel if millionaires on ESPN were saying that my death allowed them to flourish in American sports? Let's think about this now. How those who love them, how they were impacted the day after the death. So adopting a traumatological lens, but also looking at the parts of their lives. For example, this is how, and as another example, I think COVID has taken so much from us. I believe visiting sites, whether they are museums, archaeological sites, you have to place yourself, your body, as close as possible to the event. So for instance, if you got a chance to go to Montgomery, Alabama, and look at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and the parsonage, the King Parsonage, and you see there in the living room where they actually had to install a bomb door. Or you read a narrative, and if they are vulnerable or transparent enough, King talks about his kitchen experience and how he was overcome with fear. You can read Ida B. Wells' narrative or her autobiography. And when she learned of the death of her friend in Memphis and how he died, she talks about how all of a sudden she lost strength in her body. These are things we can closely relate to. And they go a long way towards helping us to humanize these people. And quite frankly, Noel, I'll say we have to revisit I hope my work will make us think twice before we have the arrogance to say how someone else's death was worth it. If we are not doing the work, I don't know that we have the moral authority to say someone else's oppression is worth it. But it can go a long way if we adopt a traumatological lens in their lives and really understand and honor their fears. That goes a long way towards humanizing them.
Yeah, it's not often that I'll just speak personally, I guess, think about other people's fears. So aware of our own. We can be so aware of our own. And that's, like you said, an experience that all of us can know what it feels like and can identify in our own lives. Thank you so much. And even just helping us think through that. And then you're talking also about visiting some of these sites and placing yourself. Yeah,
absolutely. It is, especially if you're doing the work of ministry, I think it should be an absolute requirement. Absolute requirement.
And what does that do then when you are place yourself in those locations, other than what you've already sort of said?
It helps to destabilize our illusion of a safe world. It helps to destabilize our illusion of an ordered cosmos. This is what, and I'm forgetting the name of the author now, but there's this concept, and I probably shouldn't use the term because I can't think of the name of the author. But in her text, Bystanders, she calls this, she uses this word, it's Julia, I can't remember her last name, but the term is disruptive empathy. And the disruptive part deals with disrupting our need for an illusion of this sort of ordered living. It's the same thing Job's friends struggled with. And this illusion of safety, and that if you just do X, Y, Z, you'll be safe. When you actually go there and you place your body, this is a couple of years ago, this lynching museum that I don't know, you've probably heard of that.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, to go and to place yourself in the midst of all of those symbols of what happened to those individual lives, to be inundated with it, it puts in a different perspective how you understand the work that God has called us to do, how you understand the first and second greatest commandment, love God with all your heart, but then love your neighbor. Those two are inseparable. How you understand justice.
And it sounds like what you're saying also is and the depth of what we're facing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. While social media is very powerful in disseminating information, I have a concern that social media also runs the risk of making us very superficial, where a thumbs up and we're patting ourselves on the back because we've given someone a thumbs up. But it runs the risk of making us superficial because we're not getting in depth and involving the totality of ourselves in the story and in the narratives.
I want to follow up just briefly, and we're almost going to face the end of our time here in a few minutes. And so I hope I'm not asking too hard of a question. Just about this idea of disrupting our illusion of safety and an ordered universe. And I'm just wondering if I can reflect also on what you said earlier about how a certain amount of idealization in a certain sense can be good. And can serve a positive function in our lives. I'm thinking of when I visited with my family, my young children, the site where Martin Luther King was shot and killed in Memphis last summer. And there's a sense in which it was important, I think, especially for young children, to experience that in a certain amount of safety. Their mom and dad are there providing that safety sort of covering for them, and we're able to walk in and out of that site without any sense of threat or danger, and walk around the corner and eat some barbecue afterwards. So I would imagine maybe you would say the same sort of thing, that a certain amount of safety especially for more vulnerable people like children, is a necessity. And yet there's a sense in which even for young children, I'm sure that we can still be educating them in certain ways to make it more complex, or to show them what the depth of the world is.
Absolutely. It's called development.
Yeah.
It's called human development, growth and development, age appropriate. The challenge is when there is arrested development, where we are adults, but our spiritual development was arrested because of the lies we've told ourselves, or turning a blind eye. That development was arrested at an early age, where we are stuck on religion that thrives on platitudes and fantasy and the need to be comfortable at all costs.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That is very helpful in starting to tease these things out and help us to understand what God may be calling us to through all these stories and these practices that you're talking about. I wonder if there's any final reflections that you have for us about as you do this project, as you continue to look at the lives of these titans, what are some of the practices, especially even worship practices, do you think that the stories inspire us to press into?
Thank you for that. I think about the 5th chapter of Matthew, when we're talking Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And there's a point in that 5th chapter where he says, if you are offering your gift, so we're talking about worship, and you bring it to the altar and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift and go and be reconciled. Then come back to your gift. I think when we're talking about all of this, we must remember that the work of worship precedes the act of worship. Mm. The work of worship is what we are talking about here. That has to come before the act of worship. And I fear that whether in theological education or in Christian education, there's too much emphasis on how do we create the perfect practice of worship, but we are not doing the work of worship. And when that happens, we leave these myths and these idealizations in place. We really lack depth at that point. Mm. It reminds me of King saying, in Jim Crow South, who are we worshiping on Sunday morning? And so what I am talking about here, it has serious implications for worship in my estimation, because that work of worship, similar to someone who has a toddler and a toddler is messing with something that the parent doesn't want and the parent says, leave it, leave it. Probably every parent on this call has said that before. Jesus is actually telling us, if you haven't done the work of worship, just leave the gift, leave it. Because it's not important, your practice, unless you haven't done the work of worship to be right with God and to be right with neighbor.
That's a good word. I so appreciate the depths that you're calling us to. And I have this sense that as I speak with you, all these things that you're encouraging us to lean into, to press into, and to go deeper with, that in a broader sense, what you're calling us to is to be people who are willing to, in some sense, stick out from that flow that seeks to carry us along mindlessly, that seeks to keep us comfortable and keep us hiding ourselves from the sometimes hard truths and scary truths that we don't want to acknowledge. But you keep on calling us to that real depth in our engagement in worship as disciples, as people in ministry, and as people who are seeking to love our neighbors. So I'm so thankful for you sharing from your work in that way today.
Thank you too, Noel. I couldn't do this without, thank you for walking with me in this. Thank you so much.
Yes. It's a pleasure to be able to do so, and it feels like there's a holiness to it, and so I'm glad to be with you. Thank you for being with all of us. Thank you to all of us, all of you who joined us today, and take care, and we'll see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.